Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I am Dean Detloff, your co-host.
And I'm Matt Bernico, you are the co-host.
And we're back once again with a podcast. It's been a wild week, but we're excited to talk about this particular theme. Somehow we've never talked about this, which I find kind of amazing. Out of all the things we've talked about on this show for several years now, we've never gotten to the theme of Jubilee specifically, which I think is pretty impressive. I don't know how we've managed to avoid it.
Yeah, it is pretty impressive. I mean, we've talked about it in passing a few times. So this time, we're going to talk about it not in passing, in full. I guess is what you'd call that.
I guess so, yeah. Over the past few weeks, we've been talking about the ways that Christians use different themes and pieces of the Bible to think about money and wealth. And, you know, like Matt said, we've made some nods toward Jubilee in general, but we thought it's worth talking about explicitly. And also, I just talked with the good folks at G's on Tuesday about it, so we thought, you know, let's recycle some of that material, make it a little longer, expand it out, say all the things I wish I would have said instead, and we'll be able to explore this theme together a bit. By the way, if you haven't gotten that issue of G's, the most recent issue is all about Jubilee, and it is so good. Lots of cool stuff. Matt and I both have pieces in there, alongside lots of other fantastic articles and some cool artwork, so check that out. It's like, I think it's actually one of the coolest explorations of Jubilee that I've ever seen. Just lots of different angles, you know, different artistic interpretations, etc. Anyway, Jubilee, it's a word we're using a bunch already. Maybe you have no idea what it is. It is one of those biblical ideas that's really exciting to Christians on the left, but it is actually kind of complicated, maybe more complicated than it seems on its face. So we're going to talk about the Jubilee in the context of leftist politics, think a little bit about how it appears in the Bible and more generally, and try to figure out what it has to do with us today.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so maybe you don't know what the word Jubilee even means, and that's fine. Basically, within the, like, I don't know, weird bubble of Christianity, it's referring to a particular sort of economic system that was set up in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, this sort of like ancient, I don't know, Jewish world. It's a practice that expands outside the Jewish world as well. There's evidence of all kinds of other cultures kind of having Jubilee moments, or Jubilee sort of like rules built into their economy. We'll talk about that later. But let's talk about it in the big sense, I guess. Jubilee has been, I think, a really motivating idea for people on the left within Christianity because it promises a type of economy where our debt, our poverty, and our particular place within the stratification of a class society is not permanent. And that's cool. If you are down on your luck, you sell your family's land or whatever. In a Jubilee year, you'll get it all back. And isn't that exciting? But then, of course, after that, you're going to be racing racing to the top again in the big rat race that is the economy. So not a perfect idea, not a perfect economic idea. It's not socialism. It's not like communism, but it is like a pretty cool idea that suggests that like private property is not like immutable, that there are that God in fact has made laws that say like you have to give it up at some point, give it back to people, and let slaves go free and all these kinds of other things that go along with it. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, actually, just before we get too far ahead of ourselves, maybe we should break down what the Jubilee is real quick, or do you want to do that in a moment? It just occurred to me, we're like talking about it already.
Yeah, no,
but
yeah, that's where okay. I was going right now. So
perfect.
I think, like I said, Jubilee is like a sort of economic practice of the ancient world that happened in a bunch of different societies, a bunch of different cultures. But you know, in the context of Christianity, because the Old Testament, like, you know, comes from the Jewish tradition, like that's kind of the reference point for us and for this conversation. So I'll read to you right now these good old dusty books that tell you all about the Jubilee. So this is from Leviticus 25:8-13. That's right, folks. We're reading the Bible on this podcast. You shall count off 7 Sabbaths of years, 7 times 7 years, and there shall be to you the day of 7 Sabbaths of years, even 49 years. Okay, this is a lot of words here, but this is what it means. A Jubilee happens every 49 years. Does it happen on the 50th year? Does it happen on the 49th year? No one's quite sure. It's a mystery. But
it's the 50th year. You should make the 50th year holy.
Yeah, well, there are biblical scholars who dispute this and make it more complicated, but I'm with you. Anyways, back to Leviticus after this great digression. You shall sound the loud trumpet on the 10th day of the 7th month on the day of atonement, and you shall sound the trumpet throughout all your land. You shall make the 50th year holy and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee to you, and each of you shall return to his own property, and each of you shall return to his family. That 50th year shall be a jubilee to you. In it you shall neither sow nor reap that which grows for itself, nor gather from the undressed vines. For it is a jubilee, it shall be holy to you. You shall eat of its increase out of the field. In this year of jubilee, each of you shall return to his property. Okay, some old ways of talking in this one. The syntax is kind of challenging. But there you go. That's it. So every 50 years or 49, again, it's complicated. People are studying this out here, folks, and it's complicated. But anyways, every so many years, you return property back to the people who it belonged originally. You go back to your house. You don't harvest from the fields. You just kind of like eat other food, and that's interesting. It's a big economic reset, I guess, is the big idea. Let me get into a different place where it comes up too, where it's a little more interesting to me for some reason. The way in Deuteronomy, another book of the Bible that we do love, a problematic fave maybe to be sure. Jubilee is framed like this: at the end of every 7 years, you must cancel debts. This is how it's to be done. Every creditor shall cancel any loan they have made to a fellow Israelite. They shall not require payment from anyone among their own people, because the Lord's time for canceling debts has been proclaimed. You may require payment from a foreigner, but you must cancel any debt your fellow Israelite owes you. However, there need be no poor people among you, for in the land the Lord your God is giving you to possess as your inheritance, he will richly bless you. If only you fully obey the Lord your God and are careful to follow all these commandments I am giving you today. For the Lord your God will bless you as he has promised. You will lend to many nations, but will borrow from none. You will rule over many nations, but none will rule over you. Okay, so here are two instances in the Old Testament, in these sort of like law establishing books, where we're getting some information about the Jubilee year and what it does. So it's a big reset. Everyone gets their land back. Everyone gets their debts canceled. The slaves go free. The lands rest. It's all good. I don't know. It's there's a lot of interesting ideas in there, but I mean, and we'll talk about them more specifically in a minute about like the historical relevance of some of these things, and like it's not just like Jubilee isn't just like because I don't know this particular Jewish society was like really cool and just like wanted people to like have a good reset or something. There's a lot of different reasons going on kind of behind the scenes, like why these moments are really important. But just the same, I think like on the face value of these, you can see why they would be pretty appealing to people who are interested in progressive politics, especially in 2022. Everyone's got all this bad debt. It's awful. And what if there was a moment when we just kind of reset it all? What if we said no more? What if we let the prisoners go free? What if all these kinds of things? All like what if there's a big economic leveling? Wouldn't that be nice? And yeah, it would be. I think so. But there's a lot more
Yeah.
going on here, anyways. So let's dig into it a bit, Dean. Tell us about the history. Tell us about all of the context. Lay it all out here for us.
Yeah, okay. So I think there's a lot to say about Jubilee. We'll deal with a lot of the context in a minute. I think too, if you read between the lines, I mean, I guess if you read the actual lines, but of those texts as well, you'll find that the Jubilee is complicated too, because there's a lot of freedom and there's also a lot of people who don't get freedom, or like there's a lot of resets, but also a lot of things that don't get kind of fundamentally changed. And we'll dig into all those weird nuances in a second. But I think the biggest thing to think about, for me at least, with the Jubilee, is that when I was like a young evangelical Christian anarchist type, I remember coming across these passages when you're like a very weird teen trying to read the Bible on your own from cover to cover, and being like, wow, this is so interesting. What a cool thing that like the Bible, a special book, has come up with this genius plan for economics. And I don't know about you, Matt, but like I took this to my pastor and I said, Pastor, what a fascinating situation. Like this Jubilee year, how come we don't do that today? And he had a big long explanation about how, oh, the Jubilee, yes, what a very cool idea, but all too idealistic, right? Like something that never really ever happened because humans are too bad and fallen and sinful to have ever done it. And just one of those tragic moments where if we really did live the way God wanted us to, maybe we'd do this, but we don't, so like we won't. I don't know. Did you ever hear that kind of
Yeah,
response in the
totally.
church?
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. I mean, they're wrong because that's not true. But but yes, I've heard it.
Yeah. So, like I said, I heard that from my pastor, and I guess I just kind of thought that for a long time that the Jubilee was this, like utopian ideal, something that you should strive toward, maybe something we'll get in the eschaton or something like that, but like too good to be true. Well, I've learned that that is not the case. And over the years, I've learned that. And most recently, I was reading a really interesting book that a lot of people recommended to me by Michael Hudson, who's an economist who ended up just getting very interested in ancient Near Eastern stuff and the history of debt. The book's called And Forgive Them Their Debts: Lending, Foreclosure, and Redemption from Bronze Age Finance to the Jubilee Year. Really fascinating book because it is written from the perspective of an economist, and he has this really nice line in the beginning. He says, "Today, the idea of annulling debts seems so unthinkable that not only economists, but also many theologians doubt whether the Jubilee year could have been applied regularly in practice. The widespread impression is that this Mosaic law was a product of utopian idealism, but Assyriologists have traced it to a long tradition of royal debt cancellations from Sumer in the 3rd millennium BC and Babylonia down through 1st millennium Assyria." So that was very fascinating to me, and it has appeared in other places before Hudson in general. This kind of insight, or at least before this book. But interesting to learn two things. First of all, that the Jubilee was actually practiced, and secondly, that it was also not unique to Israel in particular. That it was a sort of routine piece of a lot of economic strategies in the ancient world. And yeah, what a fascinating thing to learn.
It is a very fascinating thing to learn. You can tell your you can tell your evangelical pastor that they can shove it. It's not just like a pie in the sky idea; it's a real thing, and that's good. I think though, okay, so Jubilee as like a historical like fact, it's interesting. And like I said, there are reasons for Jubilee. It's not just because it's like a morally good idea or something, though it is, but it's a way for monarchies to consolidate power against oligarchic classes or whatever. The reset has political motivations too that are there to uphold a particular type of like class society. So it's not like Jubilee is even like completely utopian, I guess is what I'm trying to say. That there
Hmm.
are sort of political economic reasons behind like why it happens. But like that's cool. That's great. No big deal. There's a historical moment
Yeah.
and that's very interesting, I think. But I think the themes of Jubilee are things that come up again and again throughout the Bible, throughout sort of like the interpretation and reinterpretation of these like laws and the prophets, and they happen in the New Testament as well. And I think that's, I guess, maybe what's very interesting to me about Jubilee is that it sort of has this like economic reality and historical sort of factuality, but you see these like Jubilee ideas come up again and again throughout the Bible, whether it is in the prophets, or if it's in the Gospels, or if it's in the New Testament elsewhere. You get a lot of Jubilee throughout the Bible, right? This moment where there is like a leveling, or there's a redemption, or the debts that you had to pay now you don't anymore, or something, right? This like sort of theme. It's something that comes up again and again in the Bible all the time. And I think that's kind of the cool part of Jubilee, or maybe that's like the radical impulse kind of at the base of the historical example. Um, let's see. I think that there's a lot of different ways to go with this, but one I was reading in prep for this episode is from Reverend Liz Theo Harris, who's the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, which is a cool thing that I've talked about before. She emphasizes Deuteronomy 15:4, where it says, "However, there need be no poor people among you, for in the land the Lord your God is giving you to possess as your inheritance, he will richly bless you, if only you fully obey the Lord your God and are careful to follow these commandments I'm giving you today." Right. So the point here is that it's not like the specific rules of Jubilee, like the seventh year and the seventh, whatever, like it's not all of that that's necessarily important, but that like there's like this impulse that sort of like God is pushing people toward in these stories, and in like scripture, that is painting a picture of a particular type of economy where there are no poor people, or there doesn't have to be poor people if you listen to sort of God in the Bible. And I think that is the cool part of it, right? Because it gives you permission to think about Jubilee in terms that are bigger than just like a historical practice or an economic practice. Something that is a really cool idea, and but not like sort of shattering the mold of economics or something. All in all, so I think that to me is what seems cool about Jubilee is that it's not just like a thing that happened, but there's like a sort of spiritual and also political idea that's kind of bound up in Jubilee that you see worked out throughout, the history of Christianity. And that it's just is bigger than just the thing that happened.
Yeah, for sure. And the history of Judaism too, right? I always want to emphasize like I think there's sometimes a temptation to read the Jubilee theme as like so it gathers sort of momentum in the Bible, and in a second maybe I'll talk to you about some more of like what's going on outside of Israel with the Jubilee to kind of create a little contrast, but like it does kind of have this it takes on a unique flair, and it does accrue these sort of utopic expansions as the Jubilee gets filtered through the prophets and so on. And there can be a temptation sometimes to like see Jesus's participation in the Jubilee, which again we can talk about more, but to see that as like the fulfillment or the capping of
Right.
all the stuff that the Jews were doing, and you get this really bad like supersessionist kind of story.
Totally.
And I think it's important to resist that too, to see that there is something actually very interesting and unique to Judaism and how it filters this tradition that it's kind of metabolizing from its neighbors and so on. And Jesus is a participant in that tradition rather than like, I don't know,
The culmination of
replacing
it.
it.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. If that's a good way of putting it, right? Yeah, cool. Well, yeah, actually, Dean, talk about that maybe. Maybe talk about the historic like specifications of it more particularly then.
Yeah. Okay. So I think I found it really helpful to think through, first of all, like how the Jubilee appears outside of Israel, just to get an idea of where it is. Because, like you said, Matt, like it's not, it has these kind of political motivations. And when you understand that, it's actually easier to understand why the Jubilee year is not at first really a kind of utopic moment, but is actually extremely practical. So it's like it kind of takes some of the weirdness or surprise out of it and, roots it in maybe a more materialist story, for lack of a better adjective. So rulers really stood to gain a lot from debt cancellation, which might sound weird, but you have to understand that this is a pre-capitalist political economy, right? Like the rulers and the wealthy people are not necessarily one and the same, or rather, like the rulers and the kind of merchant class or moneyed class or the wealthy people who are not nobility, like those are not necessarily the same class, which is hard to get our minds around now because those people, there's still some distinctions today, but like not it's very easy to find the connections. Obviously, the capitalists are the ruling class today, which was not the case in the ancient Near East or in Israel. So, why would a ruler cancel the debts? There are lots of interesting reasons. So, you mentioned one, Matt, like preventing wealthy creditors from getting too powerful, for sure. It also prevents land from getting like bought up and monopolized. So, you can take over a country with like whatever catapults, but you can also buy it out from under them. So, canceling all the debts and returning all the lands is one way to make sure that that doesn't happen to
Those are
you.
the two big strategies in Civ 6 right there. You can
Yeah,
buy
exactly.
up all the tiles or you can get catapults.
Exactly. So if you don't want to, boost your warmonger rating, you can just buy everything up. It can also build confidence and security among the masses, right? If you're a ruler and you're nervous that people are getting too rabbly, you can cancel all the debts and everybody's excited again. And also, ancient cities with too much debt are very easy for neighboring countries to conquer for two reasons. One, because kind of the inverse of what I just said, people don't really want to go to war for you if they're like, for what? Like, just so that we stay under the debt. And we know that probably the new ruling power will like forgive them anyway. And because people also don't have the financial means to like wage a war, right? If they're all kind of snowed under. So lots of like very, again, practical economic reasons why a Jubilee year makes sense in that political economy. And again, just to borrow a quote from Michael Hudson, he says, the ethic was not egalitarian as such. It merely aimed to provide citizens with the basic minimum standard needed to be self-sustaining. Wealth accumulation was permitted and even applauded as long as it did not disrupt the normal functioning of society at large. So it's just a means of, I guess, explaining that we can understand the Jubilee year in a sort of like boring and less exciting way, which is very important because if you want to get to like where it gets exciting in the Bible, you have to like lay some of that groundwork of, again, what are those sort of practical concerns that are being addressed in the ancient Near East first.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think it's such an interesting thing though to see it through that lens because I don't know. I mean, just like you, I grew up in churches where it's like, well, Jubilee, it's so nice, but either either it's too utopic of a political idea, and like that's what it would be like in the eschaton, or it's like you can read it in an over spiritualized way where it's
Hmm.
in a very supersessionist kind of way, where Jesus, it's like it's laying the groundwork for Jesus or something like that, but. To hear the political background is pretty fascinating.
Yeah. So also, like you said, there is something unique though that happens in the course of the Bible. So I think in like Deuteronomy and Leviticus, you do see basically the encoding of this custom into law, which again is not unique. Like the Hammurabi dynasty in Babylon, they had encoded it into law as well. So like that part's not unique. But you get these I guess qualities, or I like to refer to them as like dreams, like Jubilee kind of hopes or aspirations that start to emerge in those legal texts. And then they like really take off throughout the rest of the Bible in these interesting ways. And they gather a lot of momentum. So the three that I always pull out are that in the Jubilee year, slaves get freed, the land gets to rest, and debts get canceled. And the thing about all those aspirations is like they're all present in those legal moments, but they are actually all present in extremely qualified and limited ways.
Right.
So, like, slaves go free unless it's always like a little bit of an asterisk, right? So, for example, like, the slaves who are like among the people, like the actual Israelites, they all have to have an opportunity to to be freed, but like that doesn't apply to foreigners necessarily. And like if you're a slave and you're like, actually, I don't mind it, it's pretty good. I have like a good owner or whatever, then they drive an awl through your ear and then you're a slave forever, which sounds to me like a bad deal no matter who your master might be. So for instance, those little things peek through, or like debts being canceled. Like again, debts are canceled inside the community, but even as you were just reading that Deuteronomy passage, Matt, like
Hmm.
they don't forgive the debts of foreigners. And in fact, the aspiration is you'll become the lending country.
Yeah.
Like, you will be the creditor, the ultimate creditor, and you won't owe any debt to anybody else. So it's like these are full of contradictions. And I think sometimes as progressive Christians in particular, or progressive, I don't know, people of faith, I guess, it's easy to idealize the Jubilee year and like blaze past all that stuff. But it's important actually to realize that there are those initial limitations baked into it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it's true. There are limitations baked into it, I guess. It's good. I mean, it would be it would be dishonest to say otherwise. But what is interesting though is the way that like particular imagination around Jubilee like ramps up throughout the
Hmm.
Bible, and like I don't know, like the prophets end up kind of like double downing on on a lot of this,
Right.
right? Like in Isaiah, you get stuff about every yoke is broken. It's like
Hmm.
it becomes like a bigger than Jubilee idea, where it's like this sort of like it takes on sort of eschatological meaning that this is sort of like what's coming.
Yeah, exactly. And I think maybe that's where it's actually helpful to start talking about where the biblical Jubilee does start to take on some unique character, or, departs from the neighbors of Israel in some really important ways. So, like, I was just saying, what are the practical reasons that you would have a Jubilee? There are all these reasons that, like, a king would have them. But what's so fascinating about the Bible is like the Bible is extremely suspicious of kings in general. It does not like them. Most of them are very bad. Everyone is complaining about them all the time.
In fact,
Even
in First Samuel, this is the Christian anarchist trivia that I
yeah,
still have within me. In First Samuel, though, the Israelites they're asking God, they're saying, "Give us a king. We need a king." And then God's like, "You don't want that, but okay."
yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I remember reading that passage again, probably in the same phase of being a weird Christian, talking to my pastor about the Jubilee year, right? And being like, whoa, kings are bad. The ruling authority is bad. So that is all present for sure, right? So the big question is like, okay, if the Jubilee year depends on the kings in the ancient Near East and like kings are bad in the biblical narrative, then kind of where does the Jubilee fit in? And I think that is what is super interesting. So, like, debt becomes a very big problem in the Bible. When you read the prophets, Israel is constantly getting judged for favoring the wealthy and abusing the poor, and debt and credits are part of all of that. So, what's fascinating is like you can't really rely on good kings to do debtors a favor. Like God tells the Israelites that right away. Instead, what happens is the prophets become kind of like a counter authority to the kingly authority. They're actually like, I mean, the prophets are honestly kind of a conservative force, right? Like it's the kings who are departing from what God wants,
Right,
and the
conservative
prophets
in the
are there
sense that they're
to,
like there to reinforce like the particular law that God has like given them, right? Like it's
yeah,
conservative in the way that you wouldn't. It's conservative in the way that the word actually means conservative, not in the
yeah.
the U.S. The weird U.S. politics way of understanding it.
Exactly, exactly. Or I guess you could say in that weird way that people do. Like they're radical in the etymological sense of like radical comes from radix, which means like going to the root of something. I kind of hate that phrase, but it's true of the prophets. I don't know. They're radical in that way. They are going to the root of what they think God actually wants for Israel and constantly saying, you know, the kings have betrayed that. So the Jubilee gets safeguarded by the prophets, and then it gets not just conserved in kind of a passive way, but as you were saying, Matt, it like it takes on all these other qualities, like it snowballs into something bigger than what we find in the legal text. So it becomes a dream of not just, like I don't know, you like some of the slaves go free, but some of them don't. It's like all the prisoners now are going free, right? All kinds of stuff is kind of getting added to it, and Jubilee. There are lots of like hermeneutical keys to the Bible, or I guess by that I mean like there are these kind of themes that once you discover them, you start to see them everywhere in the
Right.
Bible and you kind of read the Bible through them. And Jubilee is one of those, right? Like once you know to look for it, you start seeing it everywhere and you can really understand the whole text, including the Christian texts, as sort of participating in that Jubilee story.
Yeah, definitely. You see it all over the place. And the gospel gets taken up in some like really wild ways because it's a pretty big departure because of, because of Jesus and a lot of different other things too. But anyways, it is a cool thing that you see throughout the Bible, and it does ramp up. I guess the before we move on, like past Jubilee in like the like Deuteronomy and Leviticus texts. The thing that always like does stick out to me though in those things is that part I read a little bit earlier, where God's like, if you do these things, like there won't be poor people,
Hmm.
which I think is actually really wild to think about. Like whatever we've said, we've clarified that Jubilee has some like contradictions and is limited on the one hand, but on the other hand, it is interesting too because there is a real I don't know. I want to stress that there is like a real sort of like radical impulse within that, where like
Hmm.
God is giving a law so that literally poverty doesn't have to exist in your community, and I think that is pretty radical. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know. It's a good case. If someone does, like, I guess it's a good case to start building that like God doesn't want anyone to be poor. God doesn't cause poverty. Capitalism does that in a pretty easy way. So I
Hmm.
guess I want to, on the one hand, say Jubilee in its actual context is full of contradictions and full of limitations. Yes, that is true. But also, it is like there's a radical impulse within it that gets ramped up. And I think that's the coolest thing.
Totally, yeah. I mean, so that's also maybe a good time to move to talking about Jesus's participation in the Jubilee because, again, I don't want to pretend that Jesus is like the culmination of the Jubilee tradition, but rather what I would want to say is just like Isaiah is kind of adding to the tradition and participating in it and really like performing it in this interesting way. Jesus is in that lineage, right? That kind of prophetic tradition as well. And again, like when you see Jubilee, you start seeing it everywhere. There are so many echoes of different Jubilee passages that kind of come through the Gospels. I'll just mention one of them right now, but there's a bunch. So in Luke 4, this is where Jesus is like announcing his ministry. He goes to the synagogue, he opens up a scroll of Isaiah, and he reads a Jubilee kind of passage. So he says, The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. Then he began to say to them, "Today the scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." And that is so interesting because it's Jesus being like, here's what the Jubilee says, the year of the Lord's favor, and like, I'm here to tell you it's happening right now.
Mhm.
Like the forgiveness of debts, slaves going free, all this kind of stuff. Like, I'm here to do it. And that's the kind of the messianic mission that Jesus is on. And it's just sort of one of those echoes that you're going to see of the Jubilee in the Gospels.
Yeah, that's a great point to bring up. In Matthew 25, when Jesus is anointed with oil by the woman, I don't even remember which woman it is, but it's a woman for sure. She has some great stinky perfume, and she's gonna put it on Jesus. And all the disciples are like, Shouldn't you sell that instead?" And Jesus is like, "No, sorry, just give me this perfume." Anyways, that's also associated with Jubilee too. It's a because it's like the anointing of the Messiah. So I guess that's maybe that is like the where we can start kind of like connecting the dots here, right? So like you have Jubilee in the Old Testament in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and it's like this like sort of economic situation that is interesting for all the reasons we've already said, and it comes up again in the prophets too. And there's like the sort of like messianism that develops with it in the prophets as well. And then like the next mutation is with Jesus. There's like another sort of like theme and variation of the messianic qualities of Jubilee as well. It's different, and again, I don't want to like overwrite the like particulars of like the Jewish tradition of Jubilee or whatever with Jesus, but like that's like what's happening in the New Testament at least. It's like kind of riffing off of those same themes. Okay, well maybe to connect all the dots, I'm gonna read this piece from David Graeber, from his book on debt. He has a lot to say about Jubilee. He has a lot to say about debt. The thing about David Graeber in this book about debt is it's cool. I don't know. Um, let's see. I've read it. I'm not an economist or an anthropologist, so maybe there are critiques that people have, and it's great. Have a critique. But anyways, this book is largely focusing on like, or at least this section of this book that I'm gonna read this from is kind of focusing on like the anthropological development of like the idea of a moral debt that you always owe something to somebody else either because of like the sins that you're inheriting or the things that you've actually done or whatever. Anyways, so that's kind of the debt that David Graeber's talking about, which is deeply interconnected with economic debt as well. But there's just a lot going on. Anyways, I'm gonna read this, and you'll see how we're connecting the dots here, and maybe why it's important. David Graeber writes this: Freedom in the Bible, as in Mesopotamia, came to refer above all to release from the effects of debt. Over time, the history of the Jewish people itself came to be interpreted in this light. The liberation from bondage in Egypt was God's first paradigmatic act of redemption. The historical tribulations of the Jews, defeat, conquest, exile, were seen as misfortunes that would eventually lead to the final redemption with the coming of the Messiah, though this could only be accomplished. Prophets such as Jeremiah warned them after the Jewish people truly repented of their sins. Anyways, so that's like those are the first two pieces that we've talked about. And then
Mhm.
he goes on to say this: In this light, the adoption of the term by Christians is hardly surprising. Redemption was a release from one's burden of sin and guilt, and the end of history would be the moment when all slates are wiped clean and all debts are finally lifted with a great blast. From angelic trumpets will announce the final jubilee. If so, redemption is no longer about buying something back. It's really more of a matter of destroying the entire system of accounting. So, Jubilee is complicated. There's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of like ways that these themes are getting worked out again and again, and by different people groups, by different religious groups, by with vastly different meanings, with vastly different contexts. But you can see how they all are kind of like stacking on top of each other, and each kind of gets more intense as they go. Where it starts off as like an economic reset, and then it kind of gains this idea where like things will be better in the future. And then by the time we get this like riff off of it with Jesus, where like redemption and the erasure of debts is not about like resetting economics, but it's about like destroying the whole system of like accounting for one's like moral failings and sins.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. And I think that is something that's also really interesting, just seeing how all those concepts, like you said, are interconnected, the moral piece, the economic piece. I think this is maybe a bit of an aside, but like, it's interesting too how these things take on a life of their own. Like Pope Francis has talked a lot about criticizing international debt and calling for the forgiveness of that debt, or the abolition, I prefer to say, rather than forgiveness of that debt. But he has said, in place of that, the global north has to recognize that it owes an ecological debt to the global south,
Yeah.
that like it has to sort of pay, or whatever. And so all that to say, very interesting to see how these things sort of like slowly detach from their original usage, but kind of retain some of the utility. I don't know if that's the best language to use, but I get what the Pope means, and I think it's good.
Yeah, I think there's something to that though. Like in I mean, this is my own observation, and whatever. It's backed up by my, it's backed up by the school of life that I've been taking classes in. But like, in the original iterations of Jubilee and Leviticus and Deuteronomy, right? There's this like there's always this bit that like the land lays fallow, the land or not fallow, the land rests, right? That's the idea. You're not
Hmm.
farming during those times. So it's like it's a jubilee for people where like, there's an economic reset, but it's also a moment where you're like gonna stop, for a hot second, you're gonna stop exploiting the land. And
Hmm.
that's maybe something that like doesn't get carried over in progressive Christian ways of talking, or maybe sometimes it does, but I feel like it, listen, getting our debts like erased is so exciting that I think we forget about the rest of it sometimes. We're so psyched about it. We're so psyched about not having to pay Navient our student loans that we forget that maybe there's another part of it too. Um, but anyways, that piece I guess has been sticking in my brain today. I've been reading "Cry of the Earth, Cry of the Poor" by Leonardo Boff, which is a book about like eco-socialism and liberation theology. And there is a part of it that I think is really fascinating, where he's drawing this connection between liberation theology and like ecology, and like trying to say that these two things are not separate, like they're connected, right? So he says that the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, they both seek liberation, a liberation of the poor by themselves as an active subjects who are organized, conscious, and networked to other allies who take on their cause and their struggle, and a liberation of the earth through a new covenant between it and human beings in a brotherly and sisterly relationship, and with a kind of sustainable development that respects the different ecosystems and assures a good quality of life for future generations. So I guess I just read that out because like the cool parts of Jubilee that we get excited about, the erasure of debt, the liberation of captives, that kind of thing. That's super exciting. But I guess the liberation of ecology from capitalism is also another big piece of it that we have to kind of pay attention to. And I wouldn't want to forget that one. So
Yeah.
I'm not.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, it's also a good explanation, or a good example of how the Jubilee theme really opens up into lots of other themes. Like debt is one of them for sure, but also contained in that is the ecological relationship that we have, and also is like the abolition of prisons, or the freedom of prisoners, and so on. Right? Like the fascinating thing about Jubilee, I think we often reduce it to debt
Yeah.
because that's a big thing in our societies right now, especially. But it does have this even bigger kind of dream associated with it, or power behind it.
Yeah, I think that's true. It's, the move to thinking of Jubilee as a type of redemption that kind of breaks down the whole system of accounting. I don't know, man. I feel like it's hard to talk about that without just talking about liberation, without talking about,
Hmm.
an end to capitalism in general. Those seem like inseparable ideas to me.
Yeah, well, in fact, all right, you pulled out the Boff book. I'm going to go to our favorite devotional text on the show, which is the Gospel in Solentiname, which I've taken to reading on the weekends now. It is actually genuinely good devotional text. And I decided, when we decided to do a Jubilee episode, to look up, hang on, you'll get some good page flipping ASMR here, to look up the passage where they talk about Jesus's ministry, the Luke 4 passage, and they connect that to exactly what you're saying here, Matt. So they don't actually talk about the Jubilee piece, but instead they read this all against the backdrop of liberation, or the good news, like what is the good news and stuff like that. They talk about the freedom of all prisoners, for example, all that kind of thing. But there's a really interesting moment. So Cardinal says, I explained that the year of grace that Isaiah speaks of, and that was also called the Holy Year, was a year of general emancipation of people and goods, which Yahweh had ordered to take place in Israel every 7 years. Bought slaves should then be freed, all debts should be abolished, and lands that had been sold should be returned to their original owners. The aim of this measure was to guarantee equality and freedom to prevent the monopolizing of the lands. The law later decreed that the year of grace should be every 50 years, the Jubilee, and it was really a law that was not carried out. The prophecy of Isaiah was that the Messiah was going to announce a Lord's year of grace that would be definitive. So then this guy, William, says, and the Holy or Jubilee year now means that people go to Rome to pray in the churches and receive a papal blessing, but the Holy Year should be agrarian reform and the socialization of all means of production. And then another person says a Holy Year is what's been done in Cuba.
Hey.
So, yeah, just again, just a good example of how that Jubilee theme opens up in so many interesting ways to that truly revolutionary moment.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think that, that first of all, that's great. That's such a quintessential gospel and soul taname moment. Whatever. Mary's a communist. Jubilee is Cuba. That's such on par for that book, and it rules. But I mean, like, that's a good impulse to follow, though, right? To actually ask the question, like, what would Jubilee mean for us right now? Like, does it mean our student loan? Like, does it mean Joe Biden like signing away our student loans, or does it mean like the abolition of of loans altogether, right? Or whatever. They're good questions to start asking, though, or where we see Jubilee in the world. I think
Yeah.
those are lines of inquiry we should be considering all the time.
Yeah. Well, let's turn to that in just a minute. I thought one kind of T that we could cross before we go. We've dotted a lot of I's, but I just see a couple T's without crosses. One thing that we could do, and that I think worked really well in the G's talk on Tuesday, was also that question of like what happened to the Jubilee year. So I mentioned, it's happening all over in the ancient world, but like I don't know, why didn't it happen after Jesus came, right? Like that's a pretty good legitimate question. And surprisingly or unsurprisingly, there actually are some good historical answers to it. So a lot of this also is in that Michael Hudson book I mentioned. But the story that I've heard there and elsewhere is really fascinating. So the Jubilee year, as I said, is this pre-capitalist kind of moment, right? But if you are like a wealthy creditor and you want to keep the debts that you have and make money, you have to make sure that the Jubilee can't happen, right? Like that is an obstacle to you growing your wealth. So you need to find a way to abolish it. So there's a bunch of ways that actually did happen historically. So the Jubilee, in the Jubilee, you have these ancient rulers siding with debtors instead of creditors, which is like unimaginable right now, but like at one time was a popular thing. So creditors want to reverse that, right? They want to instantiate their side of that relationship forever in an irreversible way, so their private property can never be taken from them. So creditors eventually do win that through legal maneuvering, right? They pass laws and have legal influence through buying up small land holdings. So eventually, they kind of outrun the Jubilee returning of lands and they do monopolize anyway. And by violently repressing different debtor movements, including they like assassinate or kill kings in wars who are like tied to canceling debts, which is really fascinating. So like, just like how we talk about the history of like enclosures in capitalism is like a bloody process that requires, literally killing your resistance. The same thing is true of debt, that like debt only ever becomes permanent through like real material struggle down to actual blood being spilled over creditors being able to, not allow a jubilee to occur. And finally, the kind of nail in the coffin is that the Roman Empire sides with the creditors in all these legal ways, and they encode the creditors' right to private property into their laws. And as everybody knows the story, right? Christianity inherits the Roman Empire. That means it inherits all these weird things. And the tragedy of that is that the Jubilee sort of moment that Jesus announces actually takes a backseat to the Roman kind of subversion of that. So in this weird way, I don't know, Rome actually wins over Jesus on that score in a really sad kind of situation. So that's what happens to Jubilees, unfortunately.
Pretty big bummer. If I was the Pope and I had just inherited the Roman Empire, what I would have done is not that. I would have not done that. I would have just done the Jubilee
It's a
and,
great
and
idea.
kept it going,
I love that idea. They should have done that. Why didn't they listen to us?
Yeah,
When we get in our big Bill and Ted time machine, we'll go back and tell Constantine, don't do this.
yeah, that's right. I would say I'd tell him when we get to heaven, but might not be there.
We'll find out. Okay, so that's a T we had to cross. Let's return though to, what would it mean to actually think of the Jubilee now, since it's been erased from our contemporary experience pretty much. Um, I don't know. I think there's lots of ways to talk about Jubilee. Like Matt, you mentioned student loan forgiveness. That's one. Medical debt is huge, right? Like all these kind of debts that we struggle with. For sure, Jubilee is the theme there. I always think about it in terms of like global debt regimes, which we've talked about global debt on this show in the past. I don't know, probably in the last 6 months or so. So you could listen to that if you want to learn more. But global debt is a huge problem for people in the global south, especially. And there are a lot of bad things about it. One of the worst things is that like on the grand scheme of things, the global debt is not that much money in terms of a percentage of like global finance. Like you could wipe away all the debt of poor countries and like the world market would like have a moment, but it would be fine. Like it would stabilize, it wouldn't be a big deal. But it would mean literally like the life and death for actual human beings in the global south, if that debt was abolished. And that is where my mind always goes to. I think especially because in the year 2000, there was actually a huge campaign all around the world called the Great Jubilee. And in fact, Pope John Paul II endorsed it and like called on people to do it, which is pretty amazing. And it was a huge mobilization push at the turn of the millennium to get debt canceled for struggling countries. And they had some relative success. A lot of debt actually did get drawn down as a result of the campaign. But as you could guess, it did not get abolished. What a big surprise. And in fact, now during the pandemic, the debt of poor countries is at record levels. So that's how I always think of Jubilee. Like there was a moment, in my lifetime when like Christians all around the world kind of got excited about this theme. And they made a huge push and they made some gains, but like not enough. And like, I don't know, what if we did that again, but bigger and better? That's that's my utopic dream for Jubilee now.
Yeah, totally. I keep thinking about like, I don't know, other places we might see it or what else that might mean. And it is I think it's such a wild, imaginative force when you really start getting into it. Like, what would it really mean to like kind of set things right or to I don't know, to erase debts or even like the idea of like, you're the mutability of private property, like to give it back, right? Like, I mean, I think of like indigenous movements around land back or I mean, like, I don't know, even like reparations is really tied into these ideas. And I think it's such a wild thing to start thinking about because in progressive Christian circles, sometimes like Jubilee gets like demoted into
Hmm.
well here's we're having like a free meal today or something or
Hmm.
whatever and like those things are nice, nothing wrong with like a free meal or like feeding people for an afternoon or even like in a regular way, that's totally fine, like great. But I guess like the thing about Jubilee is that it is such a big picture thing. It's like explicitly talking about something that is like a systemic change to the way that people's lives are and how they are related to land and their economy, their debt. And I don't know. I think we do ourselves a disservice when we think about them in smaller terms.
Hmm. No, I totally agree. And it's important too to be able to connect the Jubilee to other stuff outside the Bible as well in a capitalist society. So I think another temptation we have as Christians on the left in general is to kind of be like, well, the Bible gives us all the themes that we need, all the tools that we need to make everything work. And that is not true. The world's very complicated. The Bible points us in directions to find the things that work. That's
Right.
how I like to think about it. And like the Jubilee is such a great example. Like it's like debt is a real problem, a big problem, and it's true. Like as you quoted David Graeber, like it points to this transformative moment and the abolition of all the accounting system, etc. But like if you don't tie the Jubilee demands to, for example, liberation of like the working class
Hmm.
and sovereignty over the means of production by workers themselves and so on, the cancellation of debt is not gonna. It's gonna land you in the same problem that like the Jubilee lands you in the Bible, which is that like you get a temporary reset and then you just have to start the rat race over again, and inevitably you need another Jubilee. Like what you really need is the Jubilee to end all Jubilees, or, the way they do it in the Gospel in Solentiname. You need the Jubilee that is Cuba, right? The ongoing process of the abolition of these conditions of poverty, and to see that as like the real dream of the Jubilee, to see that kind of actual transformative, lasting transformative kind of economic change, I think that's really necessary to be able to connect those dots under capitalism.
Yeah, I think that's good, right? The Bible, it's great. It gives you some good themes, but maybe not all of the sufficient tools for answering, huge questions about global finance. But if you like Deuteronomy says, if you listen to the themes that God is giving to people through the text, then like listen, there won't be poor people. I don't know. Like follow the theme of Jubilee to its logical conclusion, and like I don't know, you have no other choice but to fight against poverty in systemic ways.
hmm Yeah, maybe. Okay, here's my new thing. We always talk about big themes on this podcast, and I love them all. But I think since I've moved into working in a social movement space too, I'm also always looking for ways to, I guess, connect people up with actual practical things they can do that don't amount to just like go support the working class. It's like
Broadly.
too vague of a demand. So one thing that is so fascinating about Jubilee and debt is because of that push at the turn of the century, there actually are a lot of organizations that still exist from that time. And I think, I don't know, like they do good work and probably could use the help of lots of people who can continue to, bring a critical lens to that conversation and push it in the directions it needs to go, which is the total abolition of capitalist debt from, the poor. So a few of those, for instance, one of the best is it's called the Committee for the Abolition of Illegitimate Debt, and for some reason the acronym is CADTM. They're on Twitter that way. There's probably a very good reason for it, but I can't tell you what it is right now. Anyway, I heard about them because I read this great book called Debt, the IMF, and the World Bank from the Monthly Review. And one of the authors, Eric Toussaint, is a researcher at the CADTM. And they put out tons and tons of material just analyzing like global debt from a left-wing perspective. And it is so good. I've learned so much from them. Two other organizations. One is the Jubilee USA Network. So they're an organization that came out of the push in the late 90s for the Great Jubilee. So they still exist, and they're still saying stuff about debt. You can check that out. And the last one is Development and Peace, where I am. In 2020, a bunch of organizations signed a joint letter for canceling that debt in light of the pandemic, including DNP, and the Jubilee USA Network was there too, and the CADTM was there, and a bunch of other ones. So you can find all kinds of actual organizations to hook up with, depending on your particular point of entry or persuasion. And I think that is really the key, right? Like, if we ever want to do anything with Jubilee, it has to be like, yes, reading the Bible, I guess, thinking about it for sure, like we're doing. I think that is genuinely important, but like, also making sure that grows legs and like ends up meeting other human beings who can make real actionable demands.
Yeah, I think you're right. Jubilee is not just like a big eschatological idea. It is a real thing you can do right now.
Yeah. Exactly. And it takes that interpretive work, which is actually organizational work, I think. Like, the only way you find out what the Jubilee means, because it doesn't really have a fixed identity, right? It like grows all these different meanings and different kind of moments throughout the Bible. Like, the only way you find out what the Jubilee means is by doing it, like by organizing for it. And that is the key to figure out what it looks like, because, we made a bunch of demands that this is actually what it should look like. This is what Jubilee looks like. That'll be our new cool Christian Occupy slogan.
It's a good slogan. But yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense, right? I mean, it's a great idea, but it does take organizing work. It does take like actually doing it. I don't know. Talk to your pastor about it, but press them to help you organize about it or something. I mean, it's a great thing that it's like so explicitly Christian. I don't know. It'd be an easy sell for a congregation.
Yeah, I agree. Get your congregation out there. Do the rolling Jubilee, right? Forgive all your congregations, local debts, and everything else. And then also try to get them to, I don't know, bully your congressperson or something.
That's something.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/the Magnificast. If you support us there, you can get access to a behind the paywall podcast we do sometimes on current events and other stuff. And you can join our Discord community, which is all very interesting and fun. Matt just started a very funny channel on it, all about sharing how cute our pets are. So that's been great. I'm really enjoying that.
We got so many pets out there. They're great. These great pets.
So many of them. All these comrade cats and dogs. Love them. You can find us on the internet all over the place. I don't know what else to say about that. You know where to find us. That's why you're here. Our music is by Amari Armstrong. Our outro is by The Illogical Spoon. We'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. At least I would have